The earth, lovingly created as an environment for life to flourish, shudders in distress because creation's natural and living systems are becoming exhausted from carrying the burden of human greed and conflict. Humankind must awaken from its illusion of independence and unrestrained consumption without lasting consequences. When your willingness to live in sacred community as Christ's creation exceeds your natural fear of spiritual and relational transformation, you will become who you are called to be. The rise of Zion the Beautiful, the peaceful reign of Christ, awaits your wholehearted response to the call to make and steadfastly hold to God's covenant of peace in Jesus Christ. If you truly would become community of Christ, then embody and live the concerns and passion of Christ. Doctrine and Covenants 163 4b, 164 9b and d.
It's great to be with you again through online worship. I'm aware that in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic, the greater Pacific Northwest with other areas has been contending with massive wildfires. Each time the presidency meets, one of our first agenda items following our worship is world events. Lately, the stress, suffering, and losses from the fires have weighed heavily on our hearts and minds. Today, I'm in the Temple Chapel. I've experienced the eternal sacred here many times. I am near the beautiful Japanese meditation garden. I learned from the master gardener who cares for this space that the physical components of the meditation garden represent all creation: land, water, beaches, forest, plants, mountains, and so forth. What a wonderful setting for our worship focus today. The North American Climate Justice Team, which planned this worship, asked me to focus on the response of a prophetic people to the climate crisis. It may seem a lot to even think about right now, but amid all the challenges besetting humanity, we're facing a climate crisis due to global warming that boggles the mind. As a prophetic people, called to cooperate with God, to reconcile, heal, and seek peace in and for creation, we cannot turn away in denial, fatigue, or fear. When I was a young adult about to graduate from university, I used a week-long spring break not to vacation, but to plant trees. In fact, I planted about 2,000 trees. Why? The reasons are both environmental and spiritual. My college education included a major emphasis on ecological systems. What I learned in classrooms, laboratories, and field settings gave rise to genuine concern. It became apparent that human behavior causes the most critical environmental problems, and that realization spurred me to action. So I planted trees. Where I grew up, planting trees was a strategy to stop soil erosion, especially the loss of fertile topsoils. Trees also provide habitat for a multitude of living organisms. Also, trees take carbon dioxide from the air and release oxygen, and that is very good for us air breathers. Actually, trees also release some CO2 through their respiration cycle and as they decompose or burn, but the overall benefit to our environment is significantly positive. Now, I said a few moments ago that my reasons for planting trees were scientifically and spiritually based. I've offered a glimpse into the science, so what about the spiritual? I believe that a basic aspect of my identity as a child of God and member of this faith community is that I am called to be a responsible steward. Not just a steward of what I happen to possess, but a steward with the rest of humanity of our common household, the earth and its atmosphere. My relationship to God shapes my relationship to God's divinely proclaimed good creation. If my relationship with creation becomes distorted, abusive, or broken, I become alienated from God. As I planted trees in an attitude of concern and shared responsibility for creation, I was engaged in a sacred activity, as sacred as any worship I have ever experienced. Something in my soul came alive with awareness of deep connectedness to God, the eternal Creator. I was doing something that I was created to do as a child of God, tending and healing a wounded creation. At the last World Conference, the High Priest Quorum approved a letter of concern to the presidency about climate change. It stressed the urgent need to alert the church about the world's dire circumstances due to global warming. The letter stemmed from an announcement from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The IPCC is a United Nations agency that gathers climate research from around the world and analyzes it for all governments. It also assesses possible interventions and makes recommendations accordingly. The announcement was that the IPCC had drastically revised its forecasts of what is needed to keep climate change under control. The new forecast is that we must keep temperature increases within 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, by 2030 to avoid serious negative impacts to people, non-human life, and the whole planet. Now, previously, the target was to limit increases by 2 degrees Celsius by 2050. So the amount of temperature increase needs to be reduced, and that should be achieved sooner than projected. One of the first steps of a prophetic response is to discern accurately reality. We humans tend to deny what we do not want to face about ourselves and our circumstances. The personal or communal prophetic eye must see through diversions, illusions, and delusions. The prophetic voice must awaken people to the true reality of their circumstances and likely outcomes if behaviors do not change. I urge you to read the IPCC report on the average global temperature increase goal and related environmental impacts. Just look up IPCC online and click on the reports section. You'll probably want to begin with the executive briefs. However, if you are really into science and numbers, you can go several layers deeper to explore research methodologies and report details. To be clear, the reports are about limiting global warming to a 1.5 degree Celsius increase above pre-industrial levels by 2030. Now, the pre-industrial period of history is defined as 1850 to 1900. The report compares impacts at 1.5 degrees Celsius increase to what will happen at a 2 degrees Celsius increase. It offers scientific views on the effectiveness of various mediation strategies, such as drastic reductions in greenhouse gases emissions and widespread deployment of carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. It's not within the scope of this message to do a deep dive into the reports. However, I will highlight a few conclusions. Now, there is a certain amount of global warming that occurs from natural causes. From the report, we read, human-induced global warming on top of natural warming reached approximately 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels in 2017, and is continuing to increase at 0.2 degrees Celsius each year. Warming greater than the global average has already been experienced in many regions and seasons. Pathways limiting global warming to a 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, infrastructure, including transportation and buildings, and industrial systems. Risks to health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, human security, and economic growth are projected to increase with global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius and increase much further with 2 degrees Celsius warming. Finally, disadvantaged, impoverished, and vulnerable populations have significantly higher risks of adverse consequences. Now, I want to make sure we caught that last point. The impacts of global warming affect all aspects of our lives and livelihoods. But vulnerable populations, those without social, economic, water, and food security, will experience even greater negative impacts. So, here is what the prophetic heart and mind perceives, and I'm referring to us collectively as a prophetic faith community. There are several major interrelated crises overtaking the world right now, and widespread cooperative action is needed. In environmental science, there's a concept called carrying capacity. It is the capacity of a habitat, ecosystem, or large environment, such as the earth and its atmosphere, to support all of the life dependent on it. When carrying capacity is exceeded, nature acts. Nature acts sometimes dramatically, to rebalance the load and relieve the pressure. The church is called to be a prophetic voice through all of our voices to awaken others to the reality of climate change due to human-induced global warming and the adverse impacts already occurring. These include natural disasters, pandemic-scale diseases, and species extinctions. We must accelerate joint efforts to lessen and ideally reverse these consequences. However, if intervention strategies disproportionately negatively impact poor and oppressed peoples, a great injustice has occurred. So a prophetic people will not only advocate for action to balance and heal creation, a prophetic people must call and work for strategies that are just and equitable and that contribute to human development, especially among the most vulnerable. So to summarize, a prophetic people must accurately discern true realities that may not be apparent to others or realities they may not want to face. A prophetic people envision an alternative future in harmony with God's nature and purposes for creation. A prophetic people engage in initiatives that seek the best future for humankind and creation. A prophetic people seek just solutions that secure the well-being of the most vulnerable. And, of course, a prophetic people always pray, plan, and act in hope. One day I was walking with an evangelist who shared a story with me. He said that there was a time he became very worried to the point of distress about all the natural and human-induced calamities in the world. He felt any personal efforts to forestall great disasters had little value. He assumed the end of the world was imminent. Paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of despair, he said, he prayed passionately for perspective and hope. One day, as he was praying, the inner voice of the Spirit called him by name and said, "Dean, go plant trees." Think about that counsel for just a moment. The Spirit indicated that there was something he could do right then that would help, that would make a difference. The Spirit also invited him, encouraged him to live in a spirit of hope by doing something good that would far outlive him and be a blessing to future generations and all creation. Debilitating despair yielded to hopeful action. As a prophetic people, may we go and do likewise.